of history of what I've done over the last 25 years, and also talking about framing things really, sometimes in a different way. And the workshop exercise hopefully will explain more of that as we do that later on.
Okay, so yeah, so we're going to do a workshop afterwards, and we're going to make a start on it in the time, aren't we? But
yeah,
of course, and we're going to put it up onto Google Classrooms as well in written form, so people can either carry on there with it, and obviously people who aren't here as well can carry on with it.
Yeah, and it's really about sharing, because I think a lot of, I mean, just something very simplistic. Over the lockdown period, I've been doing a painting course, abstract painting and paintings related to colour, and trying things like acrylics and trying oil painting. But what's been really fantastic, not just about being tutored by someone who's really good at it, but the sharing with the other artists about the techniques that they've used, and realising how differently we all do things, and that's fantastic. And it helps develop your practice, I think.
Sorry, I'm just putting in a little bit. It's International Disabled Persons Day, isn't it?
I'm trying to think now. IDDP, International Day of Disabled People.
Right,
I think some places around the world it's changed to International Day of People with Disabilities. It depends on the context of how you understand the social construct of it all, which I won't go into now. But,
no, I'll go on yours. I'm just waiting for the live video, and then I don't know why I'm waiting for it. It was all ready for.
Well, I'll switch to the talk. I'm sorry, everyone. I've got so many things in my head at the moment. I've written this as well so that I don't forget things. So just say when you want me to go, Harriet.
I know. I don't know why I'm waiting for it. This is Amy's. I don't know why I've not done this bit before. This is usually Amy's expertise. It says waiting for live video, so I presume it's just setting it up.
Yeah, it'll be there in a minute, I think.
I think
I'll let you know when you're live.
Technically, we're all learning a lot.
Well, yeah.
And yes, if mine crashes at my end, I can dial back in on my telephone, I think.
Yeah. And also, well, I've made Amy co-host. Mine has been known to be dodgy, but yeah. How is everybody anyway? Everybody else?
Morning, Mummy. I'm afraid I'm in a meeting. Yeah, okay, I'm not sleeping. Good morning.
I'm well, thanks.
Yeah, so am I.
I'm okay, thank you. Just cold.
Yeah.
Oh.
Just need sunshine.
Yeah.
Are you excited about your birthday, Lise?
No. Not at all. So I've just cancelled the table I'd booked to meet 5 of my friends.
Yeah. Are you in tier 2 as well then?
Yeah. It's a bit, hey. I'll just stay 49 for another year, I think.
Why not?
Yeah.
Come on, like, yeah.
I seem to have turned into a tulip on my profile picture. My daughter changed it and I have no idea how to change it or just get rid of it.
I was going to ask if you knew how. I want to put something on mine.
I think you click on the 3 little dots in the corner.
Ooh,
and then edit.
I did that, I haven't found anything.
But and then edit profile picture. But I don't know. I haven't quite worked it out. I'd just like to get rid of the tulip. I think it's a bit weird.
What will you replace it with, Lise?
Oh, I don't know. Just my name would be fine.
Come on, live video. I don't know what's going on. Oh.
I might be able to put another photo up. Let me see.
I was looking the other day at the
doesn't seem to
remember quite a few years ago we did the cocktail making workshop.
Yeah, that was nice.
I think we need to develop that further. That was quite experimental.
That was lovely, wasn't it? But with the ingredients.
Yeah, for each one of us, yeah.
Oh, come on.
If I could sing, I'd do a song, but I'm not very good at singing.
You'll sing. Then no one need feel embarrassed.
It might be worth starting again, Harriet.
Okay. I'll start again. I mean, yeah. Okay.
I can
So-
tell you about some of the other artists I've been looking at while we're here. There was some, I don't know if anyone's seen them, they're called Four Wheel City. Some black artists, singers, they can sing in America. They're all wheelchair users, and they do some quite brilliant songs about the barriers that they face, but they're great. They're really lovely. They're quite funny as well. The video that will be on tonight, actually, on the Thrive Aid thing, one of their, but I'll send a website link as well, because I just loved their work. It was really brilliant.
What are they called, Zoe?
Four Wheel City.
Has everyone seen the thing that's going on tonight?
Yes, thank you.
No.
It's there's a sort of a festival between America, Australia, Singapore, and the UK, and there are artists from other countries as well, so Brazil and Germany, I think. And disabled artists have put their work, digital content, because people are shielding or can't go out and isolated. It's just a day to celebrate for the International Day of Disabled People, the work of disabled artists. And Tanya Rabe's got her stuff, a little film she's made of her studio and work on there. I think we've got Jane Campbell. So Baroness Jane Campbell's going to talk at the beginning to launch it, which is, we're quite lucky to have got Jane to do that. She's been fighting quite hard since March to make sure disabled people's rights are kept within all of the things that are going on, really.
Sounds really interesting.
It is. It's very much a disabled community, the UK disabled community, that does a lot of campaigning. There are a lot of activists, a lot of disability rights. It's quite interesting. And I've been doing a lot of work with Manchester Greater Coalition of Disabled People about disabled people and heritage. And I found out quite a lot about a woman called Pamela LaFane, and she was a young disabled woman. When we're going back probably to the 50s and 60s, and she, as a young disabled people, used to be put in wards with older people. There was no sort of assisted living or living independently, really. So very young people were put in wards that were really inappropriate for them. And she became a writer, and I think she had a pseudonym, and she wrote about her experiences and stuff. And there's some really interesting heritage documents about what it was like at that time, being a disabled young person. And it's changed quite a lot of law. And Alf Morris, who was a fantastic MP, did a lot of work with her and other people to share that practice. And Manchester's got a lot of that stuff in the archives. And I think over the next 10 to 20 years, we'll see a lot more of this type of heritage talked about, and the things that have gone on to continue to change practice.
Sorry.
Is it working?
Yeah, I'm going to go live right now. You ready? 1, 2, 3.
Okay, so I'm doing a talk today about my work. And I've called it Artistic Difference and Decoding Disability. It's really sort of a talk about how I've got to where I've got. And then there's the opportunity at the end for people to ask questions. But I hope this gives you a bit of an insight of the journey that I've had, and 2 artworks that I'm creating and developing at the moment. So I will begin. Also, just to say, fantastic. I hope that everyone can celebrate the International Day of Disabled People today, the 3rd of December. And find out who your disabled role models are, really. That would be fantastic to know. So I think doing this talk, and particularly doing it for Art Shape and on this day, sometimes I think it's really important to mention that I am a disabled person when I'm referencing my work as a tool and why I do the work that I do. I don't always tell everyone that I'm a disabled person. It's not always the first thing I talk about, but in some contexts it's really useful. And I also think it enables you to connect with the disabled community, that, you know, not in just the locality of where you live, but nationally and internationally. And I think sometimes it's useful to be able to very openly say I'm a disabled person. And I know sometimes people find, you know, this idea of putting yourself in a box, but I think we always need to remember that if you're a disabled person, it isn't about me as an individual, about my condition or me talking in depth about that. It's about all the barriers I faced during my lifetime, because in a way we still do exclude disabled people from all sorts of things. So I use a lot of my experiences, and people, particularly in academic circles now, talk about this as you know, as an authentic experience, but I use it in my artistic process to generate all sorts of outcomes, and with that, hopefully creativity. Sometimes with a hidden impairment, life can be quite challenging, but as a disabled person, I think it's also really important to reference that I have lots of fun and fortunately have a really good sense of humour. And I think sometimes as a disabled person, it's really important to have that sense of humour, because you come up against things which can be quite difficult. And if you spend all your life thinking about what you haven't got, it's very, very draining. It's very tiring. So I've tried to use my art to turn some of this on its head, really. So for me, if I come across a barrier or something that I think is just absurd, so it might be inaccessible transport, it may be the government type forms that I have to fill in to get access to work, to support me in the workplace. I mean, all of these things are systems and things that non-disabled people don't have to do every day of their lives. But I try to see the funny side in some of these things, because otherwise it is a constant battle, really. And I talk about creating a life less ordinary. And to me, it's amazing to have another perspective and to be on the periphery of society at times, because it enables you to look in, sometimes with a looking glass, in a slightly different way. And I'm not denying that the way society is currently structured, you know, doesn't support us in some ways, but it also irritates me and annoys me in many ways, particularly regarding the stigmatizing of disabled people. I think I'm really thankful that I became part of a world of other disabled people and adopted disability culture and a family of creative disabled artists and professionals and experts who think outside of the box. And sometimes it's really nice to be able to have conversations with other disabled people, because they know all the shit that you have to deal with, and you can just enjoy yourself and get into your creative practice. So one of the pieces that I'm going to talk about today is a piece called Sound Canvas. I created this in 2013. It was a laughing installation and a digital lounge and sound experiment. One of the reasons for doing it was to put this into a gallery setting, and it consisted of eight different boxes, and I can send some images afterwards as well to everybody listening. But it was about thinking about, when you go into galleries and things and you're constantly having to press buttons to interact with things, it just made me feel that interaction wasn't necessarily an independent thing. You might have to have someone else with you to interact with that particular exhibit or artwork. But this was all developed from sensor technology. So as you walked past it, or if you rolled past it in your wheelchair or in your electric chair, you could trigger the sensors, and then that in turn would trigger a whole series of sound files of laughter, and the laughter files were played at different speeds. And then I linked lighting to those laughter files to try and create a sort of composition of laughter, but also of lighting. So really to meet the needs of all sorts of different audiences. And it was really great for me to begin to think about, I'd always created sort of quite physical things, so sculptures and paintings, but actually in the contemporary world, you sometimes need to start thinking in a slightly different way about how you might, and particularly through COVID, generate your practice in a more digital way. So I think my work, I'm a contemporary artist, I'm a creative equality trainer, and then for quite a lot of people, I'm probably a thorn in people's sides, really, because, and I think as artists, we do like to challenge, we like to ask questions. Sometimes we're just asking questions for clarification. It's not that we're trying to be difficult or awkward, but I think artists have a really good knack for doing this. And I think that means that actually lots of organisations could benefit by employing us to help them do all sorts of things. And I trained quite early on in art and design, which was, I went and did I didn't really start doing art till A level, and I did a GCSE at that point. But then I did go on to art college and had a great time experimenting, trying out all sorts of different things. And then I went on to do an MA in art, architecture and philosophy. And at that point, I started to think, really enjoyed architecture and design and the philosophy side. And so that area of art and architecture became quite a powerful catalyst for me as an artist. And also at that time, I was a disabled person anyway, but I began to lose my sight because of my chronic condition. And I then came into contact, well, I suppose very quickly, I was thinking about all the stereotypes and all the experiences that you have as a disabled person. And I suddenly felt, as I was losing my sight, I wouldn't be able to work in a visual world, and my arts career maybe would be coming to an end. And I had that sort of thought for some time, but then I quickly began to realise, because I got onto a training scheme for disabled people, but it was for business and the business setting, I thought for a while I wouldn't be able to be an artist. So I went and worked in business. So I worked in places like the Boots Company in Nottingham on their education teams. I worked for the Joint Mobility Unit, which was part of the Royal National Institute of Blind People. I worked with things like the former Midland Bank, which is now obviously HSBC. And I got to know a lot of people in the corporate world very quickly that did work, to help disabled people. It was really the corporate social responsibility areas of those organisations. So I met some really interesting people. It wasn't about art or architectural design, but it gave me a flavour of structure, strategy, thinking things through in a different way, which as artists, sometimes we can work in our own field, but it is useful to know about some of these other things. And in working at the Royal National Institute of Blind People, I went to work in this area called the Joint Mobility Unit, which was about auditing architecture, trying to encourage architects and designers and town planners to think about more than think about, there's something called the Document Part M package, which has been the referencing really for architects and designers to think about making things accessible for disabled people. At that time, the Disability Discrimination Act was coming into force as well. But a lot of buildings or environments or built space never really thought about people with sensory impairments, people with, from a neurodivergent perspective. And I think we can still see within architecture and design and buildings and transport infrastructures that a lot of people are still excluded, and we don't talk about it in an open way. I think because of social media and because of websites and internet, more of those conversations are starting to happen. But I think I quite quickly realised, auditing a building, you could give a set of functions and functionalities which needed to change. But actually, sometimes those things didn't actually change proper practice. It still meant that organisations I was working with, or sort of the corporate sector, if they were changing the design of spaces or housing infrastructure or their shopping centres, disabled people weren't really still part of those design teams, and there was still a missing link. So I started to think about, how might I do this in a different way? And I had, because my manager was blind, it was a, it was a brilliant role model. I began to realize he came from the construction industry and was very forthright, really good at doing what he was doing, and very, he was very welcoming, very quietly spoken, but he managed to get an awful lot of things changed. And I learned an awful lot from working with him. I mean, we disagreed on lots of things, but actually fundamentally, he did teach me a lot of things. And I think I quite quickly realised that I could be developing my arts practice to actually generate more understanding for designers and architects to think differently about built space and built environment. And as an artist, you could do that. You don't necessarily need to be a fully qualified architect, because I think what we should always remember as a disabled person, we have a unique insight into how we what our needs are and how we feel that other structures and institutions should be working with us to make those things more accessible to all disabled people across the board. So I think sometimes, even if we don't have qualifications, we have incredible experience and insight, which organisations should value. I then moved into a job with something called West Midlands Disability Arts Forum in Birmingham. And that was really a development or a disability arts development agency, where I began to meet many, many disabled artists who created their work in a different way. And they used their authentic experience and their oppression that they experienced to say something which I thought was real about life, and investigated new ways of making artistic statements. I mean, this was now nearly 30 years ago. And at the time, the mainstream was not really including disabled artists. They do it more today, and there is a lot more representation of disabled people across media and across films and lots of discussions around why representation is still quite poor, really. But it's beginning to change. I think it's still hard. I think it's incredibly hard work if you are a disabled person, and particularly if you're a visible disabled person, to have the same success as non-disabled people. Now, a lot of, and some of you may know about this, American studies, they've been talking about ableists for a very long time. So this world of ableists, which really polices our norms. So ableists really prevent disabled people because you might be different, or you may approach things in a different way, or you may have a habit that people don't see as a norm within the norm. So you can be excluded from all sorts of things. So I started to, and at that time with the Disability Arts Forum, I began to understand more about the social model of disability and where this had come from, and the fact that Vic Finkelstein was quite a progressive thinker. This is really in the 70s and 80s, and he worked with Mike Oliver to develop some really good thinking around the social model of disability, and really to move away from the reference of the medical model of disability, which some of you may know all about. But I think it's really important to understand this history, this heritage, this social construct. I mean, I suppose in a way, it was developed for people to see things differently, to begin to understand how to have much more informed thinking about changing the inequality that people were facing, to put equality provision in place. And that might mean doing things in a completely different way to the way they've ever been done before. But actually that shouldn't prevent you from doing it. And sometimes I think it does, people fear change. And also I think the thing about the medical model, which we all know, is that it's about seeing people, pitying people and not valuing people, and not seeing disabled people as productive. And as somebody I work with, she talks about the medical model as the way it's about it's the what's wrong with you model, and that's how you're seen. But disabled people can do things very differently, and I think it's very difficult to do that though under the medical model. So under the social model, this expresses the idea that if you remove the barriers, then disabled people can be part of society. This means accessible transport, accessible housing, accessible public spaces, accessible language. So to include sign language, it's that whole issue around, why don't we all learn sign language in school from the beginning of when we start? Then we wouldn't need adaptations. We wouldn't necessarily need sign language interpreters. We wouldn't need all this funding to pay for accessibility. We would just all naturally do it. and actually it would work much better. But disabled people have been consistently excluded from these decision-making centres. So you can just look at that, you know, you can look at the special needs provision in school, you can look at the language they use is still very old-fashioned. They talk about these Senko teams, disabled people go into mainstream education, and then this huge team is around you to enable provision to be put in place. The provision has to be put in place because it's not accessible in the first place. And this is the thing that I find a little bit absurd in many ways. And it's disabled people, we're not the problem, it's the setup and the barriers put in the way of us that are the problem. And actually ableists, non-disabled people, really aggravate the lack of access, and then they label disabled people as helpless or needy, which is, which I said before, is completely absurd. So to think about disability differently enables you to make informed decisions and create new work. And my work is about approaching the ideals of what we think art is in a new way. So if we're presenting work to blind people, we shouldn't sort of insist that they need to understand the visual to be part of that, that exhibition, or to go and enjoy it. You know, blind and partially-sighted people sometimes are non-visual learners, so they need to start things in a different way. They need to have access in a different way. And I think this is where, as artists, you can have fun and be quite creative. So about 3 years ago, I created a piece called An Imaginary Landscape. And it was words put together. It was no visuals at all. And it was created to provide equal access for blind audiences and participants, alongside 10 other audio works by other artists as well. And it was just so exciting to do something a little bit different. It doesn't mean you can't have visual there, but I think it was about just doing it in a slightly different way. And then recent work, and this happened really before COVID, I started to think about the issue of issues for disabled women, and I started to combine something I've done for a very long time, which is about developing audio description in landscapes, which I know some of you have been involved with the working at West Burton at the Arboretum. But the domestic landscapes, I started to think about how you would audio describe a domestic setting. So if you were unable to get out into the landscape, how would you describe that using audio descriptions and doing that creatively? And it's about the challenge and the notion about, you know, what is a landscape? So for some people, if you're isolated, you can look at the work probably of Frida Kahlo. I've probably pronounced that incorrectly, but you know who I mean, the artist, the Mexican artist, about her sitting in her bed and looking out at her garden and then creating artworks of the views that she could see to the outside, and how important that outside-inside connection still is, or how inside is very important to you if you can't get out. I mean, this is part of a longer term project, because when I talk about these domestic landscapes and disabled women, I talked with a really interesting, I suppose, creative thinker, a gallery guide, somebody who was a gallery guide. He works in quite a phenomenal way now. But we started to look at the question of, as I talk about disabled women, what do I really mean? And what do we mean by the term of women or woman? And how wide is that? And maybe I need to open up that much more than I had done before. So this, I will start to develop this much more as we develop the piece, I think. But I was asked to create this piece for an exhibition in Madrid for May this year, just gone. But obviously, as I signed the contract in March, that very quickly disappeared. But I'd been working with the curator on looking at how I was encouraging disabled people to think about a domestic object in their home, and how that domestic object might be a catalyst to tell a story about their own lives, or about their own isolation, or about the funny things in their life. And it was really trying to sort of combine heritage and journeys and audio description into one thing. And I began to do this by thinking about, I wrote one myself, so I started to think about my chronic condition, about my diabetes, about diagnosis, at what that meant at a very young age. For me, it was very much about counting carbohydrates and insulin and balancing all these things, and then thinking about calculating and thinking about, I sort of have to do this, you know, at least for 12 or 13 hours of the day while I'm awake, even now, even though technology is fantastic and helps me much more. So I'm constantly thinking about the physiology of my body in relation to what I'm doing, how the environmental influences affect me, how eating or not eating affects me, and the insulin that I have to balance all of that. If I get unwell, how that impacts on it. And I've been doing this for 50 years, but I think I started to think about describing my journey through a scale, so a Salter weighing scales. And I created a piece, an audio piece, which I can send you afterwards as well, but it just doesn't sound great when I play it on Zoom. So there's sounds in the background, there's things about using the soundscape to show the ups and downs, the fluctuating ways of balancing these things. And then there's a descriptive conversation of those experiences I came into contact as a young person, and how that's impacted on my life, and how the Salter weighing scales is a, you know, I use it every morning. It's a real reference for me. It says a lot about my life, but I think hearing the artwork, you'll begin to understand. But then I started to think about it in relation to other people, because this idea of weighing things and scales and the normative ideals of beauty and womanhood, they're all very questionable. But I think we're all, you know, we all have this sort of concept of what we think that is, and sometimes we do need to undermine it, I think, is important. But as I started to develop this project, because I work in heritage and museums and galleries quite a lot, I talked to a close colleague who has looked at many objects in archives that are linked to disabled women, and linked to how they may have been designed because of their disability, their impairment. And I started to start collecting vintage kitchen pieces, because I just thought the vintage objects were really quite fascinating. All part of this sort of throwaway culture, you know, objects from the past are forgotten and we move on. But I started to think about how some vintage kitchen objects are absolutely, they've been engineered in the most amazing way. They're objects of beauty, but we do sort of get rid of them and move on to the next thing as things improve. But I think in a way we shouldn't devalue them, and it's the same as disabled people. We should also continue to think about, you know what, just because something doesn't fit in, it doesn't mean it isn't a valuable asset. And I think, you know, sometimes we think people are disposable, or disabled people are thought of as disposable. So I think I was trying to marry different things in this project, and I'm still developing it. It's still being created. So that's sort of one thing around the weighing scales. And if you listen to the piece, you'll understand more about what I'm talking about. But I'm also, because of the architecture and design, I'm also fascinated by how buildings' environments make us feel. And I've been thinking for some time about journeys through buildings and architectural spaces. And in 2012, I developed a piece, and it was really about thinking about how disabled people experience their journeys, and using technology to do that. So it may be that if you're walking through a public environment or a public space, an urban realm, as a disabled person, it was quite interesting to look at using technology to look at your heartbeat, your stress levels, how you really felt out in that public space, and then creating that into an installation, which I did in High Wycombe in 2012, and that was called First Impressions. But since then, I've been thinking about, and I've worked on the Wellcome collection quite a lot in London, and looked at a lot of the artifacts in their collection and helped them with the Being Human exhibition, which was really enlightening, really interesting, and to look at how pieces of medical kit or medication, or you know, how in the past, what wheelchairs used to look like, how really they were still very difficult to be, it still required someone to push you, you couldn't really do it independently. So it was about that whole process of how things, even when things are created for disabled people, it can still put another level of dependency in there. But also to look at how in the old gallery, before they did the Being Human gallery, how the panels of information were interpreted, and the interpretations of disabled people in some of those visual images, I found quite shocking. They were othering us, and they were quite objectifying us as well as disabled people. So I began to get quite interested in how I, as a person with a hidden impairment, how my glucose levels fluctuate when I'm in a situation where I'm stressed, or I don't feel quite right, or the acoustics in the building are not good for me. And it can be around things like when my blood sugar level drops, I find the acoustics and I get real sensory overload. And in those environments, I really, at that point when my blood sugar is dropping, I need to go to the cafe area. I need to get some food. I need to have a coffee with sugar. I need to think these things through. But often when I go to the cafe area, it's probably the worst area in the building to go to because it's very, very noisy, and they use hard surfaces, hard tables, hard floors, big, vast open ceilings, not very good lighting. So I feel worse. So not only am I having a hypo, getting sensory overload, I'm in a space where I'm trying to fix it, but I can feel quite unpleasant. And I thought one way I could try and show this without, because one of the things as disabled people is you always sound like you're moaning and you're sort of going on again, and people stop listening to you because they've heard it 1,000 times. And I thought what I'd want to do is to create, using my insulin pump, which I have now, and using sensor technology, is to show how, because of the sensor technology, I can have all the information of my blood sugar levels, every minute of the day on my mobile phone, so I can see what's going on a different graph. This is why I was sort of talking about decoding difference with this new piece. But I think I wanted to look at how my fluctuating blood glucose levels highlight how I could highlight differences through public art. So I was thinking about, in relation to my blood sugar levels and the paint I might use on the canvas and how the colours might change depending on my blood sugar levels, how I could represent that. And then I don't know why, I just suddenly thought, this is silly. What I should be doing is lighting up the outside of a building. And if I'm in that building, or people with certain conditions are in the building should change colour depending on how you're feeling or how those blood sugar levels are fluctuating. And I thought this would this would show a lot about hidden impairments to people on the outside. And so I just really want to play with that. So at the moment, I'm working on how do I link my sensor to a whole lighting system inside a building and then show that on the outside of the building. It's incredibly experimental, but I think for me, it's about having this beautiful aesthetic on the outside of the building. And this represents a whole load of different things about the things that can actually happen to you internally as a disabled person. But nobody necessarily sees that turmoil going on. They just see this beautiful outside and this aesthetic. Because in a way, I think, and this goes back to the social model, it goes back to the ableist thinking, a lot of us end up having to manage internalized ableism because we're always trying to fit in and we're always retrofitting, and environments and spaces are designed in a way to still exclude us, and they're still sort of fixing the problems from the past rather than thinking about the future. So I'm just trying to develop this artwork and get, like all of us, get funding and the right support to make it happen. But I think, I will get there. And I think it's really interesting to start thinking about different ways that we can use our experiences to go on another journey to creatively create things that that artistically are there for audiences to see in a different way. They don't need to know the whole story to enjoy the piece. I think that's one of the other important things. But if people do want to know about the story, then they have the opportunity to do that. So that's most of the talk. Is there any questions?